Good morning, James.
Good morning, Liz. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Thanks so
Good.
much for joining me this morning.
That's all right.
Yeah, I thought it would be interesting for other industry practitioners to hear from experts such as yourself, a little bit about how you got into the industry and what's happening with your current challenges. So
Sure.
could I get you to just share with everybody what your role is?
Sure. I'm head of business development at Oxford Airport and have been there on and off for a good decade or so, but at the Oxford Airport for near on 20 years now, which is a bit frightening. I had a little excursion to Cambridge for a couple of years, but came back about 2 or 3 years ago. So yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the airport, what it does, who it serves,
Sure.
Well, in the community?
Oxford is like a lot of general aviation airports. We're all different. We're all unique in our own particular way. You can't really sort of put us into a particular pigeonhole. We host about 20 or so different companies at the airport, and they employ about 1,000 people between them. And it is a mix of traditional sort of pilot training activities, but also a lot of business aviation activity as well. So we've evolved in the last 10 years or so to be the fifth or sixth largest host of business aviation activity in the UK. And although we're Oxford, we're in the London catchment area. And as a consequence of that, we see about 5,500 business aircraft flights a year. That's a very important part of our portfolio. But within that portfolio are a lot of other aviation-related businesses that get involved with design, engineering, maintenance, refurbishment, aircraft sales, etc. So a very diverse set of businesses hosted on our airfield, which makes it a very nice little community of aviation industry. Yeah.
And if I just get you to backtrack, you said you've been there for 20 years. What are some of the larger changes that you've seen in that 20 years from then to today?
Well, we've evolved fundamentally from a basic general aviation airport with fairly straightforward systems and capabilities to, I would argue, a fully commercially capable airport. We've spent about £25 million or so on the infrastructure of the airfield to enhance our capabilities and systems over that period. So most of that has actually happened in the last 10 years, but that includes things like a £4 million worth of a radar system, completely changing all of our comms and navigation systems within the air traffic control infrastructure, new lights on the runway, in fact a new runway back in 2006. And so all of these things have been done to enhance our capabilities to be able to host commercial activity and be a 365-day, all-weather, day-night operation, as is required by the business aviation community, but also the commercial airline sector as well. And although we don't host any airline activity today, we are actually quite capable of doing so, should we choose to do so anytime in the future. Yeah.
That's very interesting to me, as I remember my first visits to Oxford or London Oxford or Kidlington, as I then used to know, it was very much about flight training, and it was, I think at one point, the largest provider of or had the greatest number of movements for its flight training activities. Am I remembering that correctly?
No, that's correct. Basically, historically, we've always been known around the world, in fact, as one of the primary places for professional pilot training. And at one point, it was the largest pilot training academy operation in Europe, maybe even the world, actually. But certainly the runway was once the busiest single runway in the world, with about 235,000 movements a year back in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So historically, that had completely dominated what went on at Oxford, and that entailed about 95 to 98% of the activity on the airfield. But as time has gone by, that has changed quite radically. And so there's a much more diverse mix of activities on the airfield now. Pilot training is still an important integral part of that, but it probably represents less than 50% of the activity today. And there's a lot of helicopter activity, of course, with Airbus helicopters, UK headquarters based with us. And then that business aviation activity has come in to fill the gap to a certain extent. But the pilot training side of the equation has changed enormously and quite radically over even just the last 10 years. So we've had to evolve and move with the times and do other things to compensate for that fairly significant decline in the pilot training side of the equation. Yeah.
And before I move back to some of the other activities on the airfield, you said that pilot training has changed radically, which it has. What changes are you observing with the clients that you have on the field? What kind of noticeable differences are there?
The pilot training has changed in so much that a lot of the VFR flight training activity is now moved overseas. So our primary operation, Oxford Aviation Academy, some time ago moved pretty much all of the VFR flight training activities to the United States. First, that was in actually Texas, but now in Arizona. But they now have, as CAE, they have operations in other parts of Europe as well. But then there's a lot more focus on simulator use. So the amount of training done in simulators versus actual physical aeroplane flying, again, has changed radically. So that amount of time flown in twin piston engine airplanes in the skies around Oxford has declined by probably 70% or so. So it's a very fundamental change to the ethos and the philosophy and the practices undertaken. Still a good, few hundred students coming through each year, but the philosophy of how you do that training has changed quite considerably.
And it must be great to have so many young people around the field. There's quite a good energy, I feel, whenever I come to visit the whole, both your the FBO, which is gorgeous, but then the cafe is always full of young people. And there's a really great energy there.
It's got a sort of university campus feel about it. Mm-hmm. On occasion. When it's busy and there are a lot of students around, you do get that sort of vibe. It is a training academy environment. So you've got a lot of the students living on site. There's about 150 bedrooms or so on site. So a lot of the students do live at the airport. And then you've got lecture theatres, you've got classrooms. It's a university campus for pilots, but with all the other things going on as well. So it's a great place to work.
Yeah, and that again, you're challenged too, because you've obviously had to change the strategic direction of winning business for the airfield. Can you talk a little bit about that, some of the challenges that you've experienced, and how you've attracted new clients and changed the dynamic slightly from being, radically changed actually, from being the flight training campus to a thriving business aviation hub today?
I think the key things were enhancing the physical capabilities of the airfield and also things like operating hours. With the runway, we maximized the license length of the runway by moving a lot of obstacles that existed before about 2007 or 2008. And so we now have a 1,552 meter runway, which is viable for most of the business aviation sector and most of the requirements around Europe. In addition to that, we widened the runway, we strengthened it, so it's now actually stronger than, say, London City Airport. We grooved the runway so that when it rains, the dissipation of the water is much quicker than it would be otherwise. We've put in things like a full instrument landing system with Cat 1 ILS lighting. We're in the process at the moment of having RNAV GNSS approaches at both ends of the runway. And then on the south end, we'll have LPV 200 capability, which will include some more modern lighting on the approach to the southern approach of the runway. So all of these things basically enhance the capabilities of the airfield in all weathers, in all circumstances, wind directions, etc. But then on top of that, we've built up our resources and capabilities to actually now have, I believe, the longest opening hours of any general aviation airport in the United Kingdom. So aside from the commercial airports that can open 24 hours, if you take all of our other peers, we are now open, well, we're open from 6:30 in the mornings shortly to 2300, 7 days a week. And that's a critical thing, because at the weekends, many of our peers have to, because of planning constraints, they have to close earlier or open later. We have the same hours, 7 days a week. And we actually have the capability to open from 6 in the mornings till midnight on request any day, 7 days of the week. And so that's fundamentally a better capability than many of our peers. And that's quite important to a lot of the business aviation sector. They just want the comfort of knowing they're able to get back into their home airfield late at night after a sporting event or something, especially at the weekends. And we can do that now. So we've just ticked all the boxes slowly to enhance the overall capabilities of the airport. And it's an ongoing process, so there's more to come. And we're exploring, we are exploring the capability to open even longer still. Our fire capability, fire and rescue capability has got better as well. So all these things, you go slowly and try and make them better and better to the point at which you've got a better service offering than most of your peers. Yeah.
Now, you've talked there about some great results and the steps that you've got, enhancing the runway capabilities, enhancing, extending opening hours.
Yeah.
Just to take one of those elements, stating that as a fact is great. The reality of making that happen must have been enormously challenging. And in today's climate in the UK, where we've got lots of airfields under threat, can you just speak a little bit about what it is you do to work within the local community? Why is it that the local community, they must be supportive of what you're doing by and large for you to be able to extend the opening hours, I'm guessing. Am I correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, we once upon a time, before about 2006, we actually had zero planning constraints imposed upon us because there had never been a circumstance before that whereby the local authority had the opportunity to say, whoa, you need to operate within these parameters. Then we needed to do things to the runway. And we entered into a Section 106 agreement, which is a planning constraint, arguably, that dictates the parameters that your airport can work within. And when we sat down and negotiated with them for that, we agreed the overall capacity, flying capacity of the airport. So that's at 160,000 movements a year. We're not even a quarter of that at the moment. So masses of headroom there. In terms of the operating hours, we tabled our proposals and they said, we'll let you operate from 6 till midnight. And that's fine. Albeit, we would like to be able to open after midnight, and we'll be looking at that in due course. So you have constraints imposed upon you by your local authority. Many of our peers would have had those constraints decided upon years ago, decades and decades ago. In our case, we only actually got to that point about a decade ago for us, so back in 2006. But what you need to do in order to survive as a general aviation airport is diversify. Property related revenues is a massive part of the equation. To put it in perspective, our aviation revenues, that is landing fees, profits from fuel sales, handling fees in the FBO, that kind of income doesn't go anywhere near paying for the cost of running the airport. We survive because we have a property portfolio which allows us to rent out offices and hangars to tenants, and that property income absolutely underwrites the cost of running the airport. And so for our peers and ourselves, any other general aviation airports that are trying to survive out there, it is it is absolutely critical that you have other income streams apart from those solely derived from aviation activity. Otherwise, the figures normally never stack up. You've got to have peripheral income, and then you've got to have your local authority supporting you and recognizing the fact that you need to build more tin sheds, you need to build more office blocks, a hotel, whatever it may be, in order to continue to have a viable operating business aviation airport or general aviation airport. And so in our case, our local authority are fairly supportive of that, and they are very pro the airport. They love having the airport on their doorstep, and we don't generally find much resistance to what we want to do, which is great. It's not always the case. A lot of our peer GA airports have a tough time and lots of battles fighting with either the locals that live on their doorstep or fighting their local authority who won't let them evolve and won't let them develop. To give you a classic case, there are plenty of airfields in the past that had grass runways, which are completely useless generally in the winter months, and they desperately wanted to convert those grass runways into tarmac surfaces, and places like Sywell, for example, have done that. Places like Red Hill have been desperately trying to do that forever, and just constantly meet resistance on that front. And that's horrendous. I mean, you really need that moral support of the local community and your local authority to let you do things to make you into a viable commercial enterprise. Otherwise, it's tough out there.
And what is it that you do to, it sounds as though you've generally got a supportive local authority and local community, but what kind of activities do you engage in to win hearts and minds and to maintain the relationships that you have in your local area?
I mean, I suppose there's a lot of business networking that goes on. You get involved with the Chamber of Commerce, you get involved with other small business, medium-sized business networking opportunities that exist around you. So that there's a general understanding of what goes on at your airport. In our case, we've got some pretty major players based with us, the likes of Airbus Helicopters, CAE, some of the biggest players in the world in their particular sectors. They're very high profile, so that helps. But the peripheral benefits to the local community of having 800 to 1,000 people working on an airfield like ours, there are so many peripheral opportunities to the local business community, services that are supplying those companies that are based on the airfield. So raising awareness of what you do and the benefits to the whole sort of aviation community, but also the local community, is just an ongoing, regular thing. And you have to wave your flag high and make lots of positive noise when the opportunities arise. And generally, that keeps people on side. Yeah.
And you've got a brand new hotel opening early next year.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, probably about this time, October, November next year. I would
in about a year's time.
Yeah.
And again, how many jobs is that likely to create? Let alone peripheral jobs of.
I think it's about 50 or so. 50 or so. I mean, that hotel is not ours per se. It's been built by a third party, but it happens to be next to the entrance to the airport. But yeah, it's all part of the infrastructure that makes it a more viable place to base a business, to work, and then to operate in and out of. So having that will be a fantastic advantage. It's literally walking distance, probably about 3 or 4 minutes walking distance from the entrance to our FBO building to our terminal. So it's going to be a great advantage on our doorstep. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just want to slightly come a little bit off this subject and move to you, James, Dillon, Godfray. How did you get involved with aviation in the first place? What led you to what you're doing today?
Well, it's been a funny journey because I started off as an engineering apprenticeship. So I did an engineering apprenticeship at the de Havilland Training School at Hatfield many years ago. I can't even remember how long ago, but say 35 years or so. And then I joined at the end of that process, which was a 4.5 year process. I ended up in the Hawker 125 sales operation, which was headquartered in Hatfield, but had, you know, guys all over the world. And my patch I ended up in was the sort of Far East and Asia Pacific region. So I ended up going out there for near on a decade or so. Most of my life was living out of a suitcase in sort of Japan and Korea and places like that. And I loved it, absolutely amazing. So my early 20s, actually most of my 20s, was in the aircraft sales environment. And then I came back and I worked for Air Hansen at Blackbush Airport, which was predominantly helicopter-oriented enterprise, engineering, operations, charter, the whole sort of portfolio of business aviation activities, and also fixed-wing aircraft sales. So we were a Hawker Beechcraft representative. And then I think I then joined CSC Aviation, which was a big engineering operation at Oxford Airport. And yes, that was about 20 years ago. So I was there for several years on that side of the equation, which again also involved in some aircraft sales. And then I think it was about 2003, the owners at that time of both the Flying Training School, CSC Aviation, the engineering business, and also the airport, which were all one and the same. They're all part of the same company. They split all of those up. They sold off different elements of that business. And we recognized that the pilot training side was moving off in various different directions. So the conscious decision was made to develop the airport as a standalone business. So for the first time in its history, it was hived off as a standalone business. And then we stood back and said, okay, what do we need to do to make this a viable business? Because on its own, as an airport 12, 13 years ago, not a hope in hell that the numbers stacked up as a viable business. So we built more hangars, we built more facilities, and we did everything else I talked about earlier. So that was how I sort of got into the aircraft world, the airports world, as opposed to every other aspect of aviation. And I just sort of been involved in that side of the equation ever since, I suppose. Yeah.
It's pretty good because it sounds like you yourself have got experience in many of your tenants' businesses that they have. So you have some kind of proper understanding of what it is they're aiming to do.
Yeah, it does help to have having had that background. Most of the operations that are on the airfield have probably dabbled a little bit in what they're doing in the past. So yeah, it certainly helps to have a basic understanding of their needs and their aspirations and that kind of thing. So yeah.
What would be one of the single most challenging moments that you've had that has kept you awake at night and wondering how the hell you're going to manage to solve that particular thing?
I think we're constantly overwhelmed and bombarded by red tape. It's the aviation world. The aviation world is run by or adheres to a set of rules and regulations that are really tightly controlled. But then on top of that, as an airport, we then have security constraints and other constraints that really have got worse and worse over the years. There's this great aim within our general aviation sector and the business aviation sector to try and sort of reduce the amount of red tape that exists and the constraints to just getting on with your business. The reality is it's progressively just got worse and worse over the years. Now, some things are absolutely inherently important for safety's sake and security's sake. But boy, it is a headache. It is a real headache. And you compare the way that the airports and aviation sector is overseen by the legislators and the regulators compared to the train industry or the automotive industry or any other kind of transportation, and just think, this is crazy. This is absolutely insane. Why do we have this incredible bureaucracy imposed upon us compared to all of those other forms of transportation? some of it's entirely logical, but at times you do wake up and think, this is crazy, absolutely crazy. And as you evolve from a puddle jumping general aviation airport into something more commercially oriented, it just gets worse and worse and worse, and you have to live with that and you have to deal with it. But boy, is it a challenge sometimes.
And what do you do? Oh, sorry, go on.
And expensive. Compliance is expensive.
What do you do to keep yourself motivated when, you think you've just overcome one hurdle and then bang, something else comes along that that stymies you again? What keeps you, what kind of things do you personally do to keep yourself up?
Go home and open a bottle of wine, I think. That's probably the best policy. No, I mean, you have good days and bad days, but no, you just get on with it. You get on with it and you just move on to the next day. And, you just live with it, and you work within the system.
Yeah, and you have a good team of people around you too, don't you?
Of course. We have a fantastic team. We're a very I suppose a very transparent and small team. If I look at some of the infrastructure and the resources at some of our peer airports, and we have a very neat team, not a lot of levels of management involved. It's a very streamlined operation. Sometimes one of the challenges we have at our airport is you have incredible peaks and troughs of activity. Some of our peers have a much more predictable flow of traffic, be that business aviation traffic or the GA side of the equation. With us, it goes up and down like a yo-yo, and we have to work within those parameters, and that can be quite challenging sometimes. So you're constantly in our case, we have no idea, more or less no idea, how busy we're going to be in 48 hours time or next week. And even just this week, we've gone from a couple of days where we've only had a handful of aircraft to, say, for today and tomorrow, it's absolutely mad, because I think there's probably some sort of high-profile wedding going on our doorstep somewhere, and so the world and his wife is flying in for that. So you have the challenges of dealing with those peaks and troughs. And for us, I think compared to some of my well-known peers, is much more of a challenge actually. Yeah. And
how would you attract young people now to come into your world, or this world, our world?
I think that is a great challenge, because there's some wonderful organisations. There's an outfit called Fly to Help, who do they do a week during the half terms, a sort of scholarship week during the half terms in October and other times of the year, where they encourage young people who are interested in aviation world to come for a week, and they see all sides of our industry, and they come to the airport, they go and see Airbus, they go and pop down to Bryce Norton, see the RAF operation there, and then they go and see other sides of the industry. So during those 5 days, they get a really good taste of all aspects of aviation. Of course, most of them say, I want to become a pilot, or I want to become an engineer. But of course, there are a multitude of other career paths to go down. And I think, where the opportunities arise, getting your first job in sort of, in the charter brokering world, or any of the sort of back office functions within the airport, or any of the companies that are on the airfield, is a great starting point. So whatever your interests are, there are people like Airbus who do apprenticeships, but they're very few and far between, I have to say. There are not a lot of apprenticeships around, especially sort of degree level apprenticeships. So it would be wonderful if that could be stimulated, for there to be a greater number of those kinds of things on offer to young people. I think it is growing, but you compare the number of apprentices available versus the numbers that are going into university, and there's a massive massive hill to climb. We're a long way off, I think, from where we ought to be.
A shout out to Georgina Godfray there, Fly to Help, fantastic.
I know, they've done an amazing job, and all credit to them. But it's such a it's such a small scale. We need that times 20 really. But they do a fantastic job. Yeah.
Do you have work experience people at the airport? Do you sometimes have internships? Is that?
We don't have internships per se, but we do have people sort of coming for work experience. Because of some of the health and safety aspects and the security aspects, etc. We tend to have the older children rather than the young sort of 11-year-olds. So we're tending to go for the, what age would they be? 14, 15-year-olds, that kind of thing. So yes, we do. We can't do it all day, every day, but we do do it a few times a year. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there you go, folks. Anyone listening? And lastly, I'm going to move. Obviously, we've got to know each other a little bit better recently because we've just done a video for the airport. Can you talk to me a little bit about now? You're talking about waving the flag and getting the message out.
Yeah.
Why did you opt to try a video? What made you move into that?
I think, within the sort of PR publicity toolkit, you've got lots of things you can do, from bog standard advertising and lots of other avenues you can pursue. For us, we hadn't done a sort of corporate video for a wee while, maybe about 8 or so years, and I just thought it would be a good idea to do something slightly off the wall and slightly tongue-in-cheek, and as you well know, we've done a great little video about a story about one of our customers leaving their dog on their aeroplane and us having to get that reunited with the family back in London. And the story is fundamentally reaffirming the fact that we're not a million miles away from London, and you can get to London in an hour from Oxford Airport. And anyway, so that little 2-minute video is a great tool to put out there, via social media and via other platforms on your website, etc. And it's a bit of fun, and it doesn't really have a shelf life. It's something that people will discover for several years hence, and it will be relevant in 3 years' time as it is today. So it's just another thing one can do that you can put out there. Social media being what it is today, it's just changed phenomenally in the last, 5 years, I suppose. It sometimes drives everybody nuts, but it's there. You better capitalize on it, because the world and his oysters, plumbed into that. So make the most of it. Yeah. Yeah.
No, obviously I'm a big video fan. It was great to do something evergreen with, as you say, no shelf life to it when you've got an actual story-based thing. But something like this too, as a form of communication where we're just chatting on video, I think is also of value too, because people get to see you, hear about the airport. You've given us some great insights too to what other people in the same situation as you are could perhaps do, especially in terms of engaging with the community and what you do to network. So I really appreciate that. Thanks, James.
No, not a problem at all. Good.
Well, thank you very much for joining me, and I look forward to the later developments now as they unfold in Oxford Airport, and I hope that everybody has a great fun time at the wedding today, whatever they're up to.
I'm not sure who's getting married, but it's obviously somebody of note. We'll find out when I get to work.
Thanks, James.
Right.
Thanks a lot.
No problem at all. Good to talk to you. Bye.